I arrived at my parents' house late on Thanksgiving with the smell of antiseptic still clinging to my hands and the low hum of exhaustion settling into my bones because I had worked a double shift at the family clinic and skipped lunch so someone else could go home early. And I remember thinking as I parked on the street that I would keep my head down, smile politely, and leave as soon as dessert was served because that was how I had survived holidays for as long as I could remember. Inside the house, everything looked perfect. In the way that only appearances mattered, the turkey roasting in the oven, the television murmuring a football game. Nobody was really watching, and my mother moving plates with sharp, efficient motions while repeating that family was everything and that we should all be grateful to be together. My father glanced at the clock when I walked in and said nothing, but the silence carried its own accusation, and my brother Daniel was already at the table with a drink in his hand, laughing too loudly at something on his phone. I took off my coat and set it on the chair, and my mother immediately commented on my clothes, asking if that was really what I chose to wear on a holiday, and I swallowed the familiar response and said it was all I had time to grab after work. My father cut me off before I could explain further and told me to sit down because dinner was almost ready, and Daniel smirked and raised his glass toward me as if to toast my inconvenience. We sat, and the table filled with the sounds of forks and small talk, and every time I spoke, my words seemed to fall into a quiet pocket that nobody acknowledged, while Daniel told stories about his job and my parents leaned in, nodding as if every sentence he spoke mattered. When I reached for the bread, my mother sighed and told me to leave some for others, and Daniel laughed and said I always acted like I was starving, and something in my chest tightened, but I said nothing. The tension built slowly the way it always did, with little comments and glances, and the sense that I was taking up space I had not earned until Daniel made a joke about my clinic job, asking if I was still playing nurse, and my father chuckled and said, "At least it kept me busy." I tried to deflect and said I liked helping people, and my mother put her fork down and told me that Thanksgiving was not the time to make everything about myself. And that was when something shifted because the room went quiet and Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching me with an unfocused intensity. I said I was not making anything about myself, and my mother shook her head and said she was tired of my attitude and tired of me always ruining holidays. And my father added that I should learn from my brother who knew how to appreciate family. My hands were shaking under the table, and I felt the heat rise in my face as I asked quietly why everything I did was always wrong, and my mother looked at me with a flat expression and said that sometimes she wondered how different things would have been if I had never been born. The words landed heavier than any sound in the room, and for a moment I could not breathe, and my father did not correct her, and Daniel stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor, and before I could move his hand, struck my face with a sharp crack that echoed off the walls. The force turned my head, and my cheek burned, and I tasted metal, and someone gasped, but nobody stepped between us, and Daniel grabbed my wrist hard enough that pain shot up my arm and dragged me toward the kitchen, telling me to stop making a scene. My father said enough, but he was looking at me, not at him, and my mother turned back to the table and began straightening the place settings as if the problem was the mess, not the violence, and a distant relative near the doorway whispered that I should calm down. I pulled free and stumbled toward the door, and no one followed me, and outside, the cold air hit my face, and I stood by my car, shaking as I locked the doors and looked at my reflection in the window where a red mark was already forming on my cheek. I took my phone out with trembling fingers and took a photo because something inside me knew I would need it, and a voicemail notification popped up, and when I pressed play, my mother's voice filled the car, telling me that I had embarrassed the family, and that I knew how my brother got, and that I should not have pushed him. I sat there listening to the message end, and the silence afterward felt heavier than the house I had just left. And as I drove away, I understood with painful clarity that the people who were supposed to protect me would always protect the harm instead. I learned very early in life what it meant to be the child who was tolerated rather than chosen, and I did not have the language for it then, but I felt it in my body in the way I learned to move quietly through rooms and in the way I measured my words before speaking, because Daniel had been born 5 years before me. And by the time I arrived, my parents already had a son who filled every expectation they had ever imagined. Daniel was loud, confident, and demanding, and my parents called it leadership while I was quiet, observant, and careful, and they called it difficult. Our house had 3 bedrooms, and Daniel had the one at the end of the hall with 2 windows and a wide closet and a door that locked properly, while I slept in the smaller room across from the bathroom where the pipes rattled at night and the light from the hallway leaked in under the door, no matter how many times I tried to block it with towels. On his walls were framed photos of soccer teams and school certificates and birthday cards that had been carefully opened and taped up like trophies, while mine held a corkboard with permission slips and reminders because my achievements were treated like obligations rather than moments worth celebrating. On his birthdays, my mother baked layered cakes and invited his friends, and my father grilled burgers in the backyard, and everyone laughed loudly and stayed late. And when it was my turn, the parties were smaller, quieter, and often rushed because someone had something else to do, and my gifts were practical things, like notebooks or clothes picked off a sale rack while Daniel unwrapped electronics and sports gear, and my parents told me I should be grateful because I was easier to shop for. When Daniel forgot his homework or failed a test, my mother said boys matured later and my father blamed the teachers, but when I brought home a grade that was less than perfect, they asked what I had done wrong and why I was not trying harder. At dinner, Daniel spoke over everyone, and my parents leaned in asking follow-up questions as if every story he told was important, and when I tried to join the conversation, my father would say, "Not now," Claire or my mother would correct the way I pronounced a word, and then continue listening to Daniel as if I had never spoken. I learned to stop interrupting, and then I learned to stop talking at all because silence was safer and easier to explain than disappointment. When Daniel slammed doors or raised his voice, my parents said he was passionate and needed space. But when I cried, my mother told me I was too sensitive and needed to toughen up, and my father reminded me that life was not fair and I should get used to it. I remember standing in the kitchen once watching Daniel argue with my mother about a curfew, and my father stepped in immediately telling him to calm down and putting a hand on his shoulder while my mother nodded. And when Daniel stormed off, my mother sighed and said parenting was hard, and then she turned to me and asked why I looked upset, as if I had not just witnessed the difference in how we were handled. At school, Daniel was known as the Golden Boy, and teachers praised his confidence while I was described as withdrawn. And when I tried to explain to my parents that I felt invisible, my mother laughed and said I had an imagination, and my father said I should stop comparing myself to my brother. Comparison was unavoidable because everything in our house was measured against him, from how I dressed to how I spoke to how much attention I required. And the lesson was always the same, which was that Daniel deserved patience and I deserved discipline. By the time I reached my teens, I understood that love in our family was conditional, and that the conditions were never written down for me, but they were always enforced, and I learned how to earn peace by being agreeable, by apologizing even when I had done nothing wrong, and by stepping aside so Daniel could shine. I told myself that one day it would make sense that my parents would see me and realize that I had always been there trying to be good enough and useful enough and small enough to fit into the space they allowed me, and I carried that hope quietly, because hope was the only thing they had not taken from me yet. Daniel learned early that anger was a currency our parents accepted and even rewarded, and the older he got, the more confidently he spent it, because every outburst was met with explanations instead of consequences, and every crossed line was smoothed over before it could leave a mark on him. When he shoved a boy at school, my mother said the other kid must have provoked him, and my father joked that boys needed to learn how to stand their ground, and when the school called about detention, they framed it as a misunderstanding rather than a warning. At home, Daniel slammed doors and punched walls, and the drywall dents became part of the house like a timeline of his moods, and my parents called it stress or pressure or growing pains, while I learned to flinch at sudden sounds and adjust my movements so I would not become the next target. When he raised his voice at my mother, she hushed me with a look as if my presence made things worse. And when he cursed at my father laughed it off and said he would calm down soon, and then told me to stop staring because I was escalating things. Every incident came with a story that softened Daniel and sharpened me, and I became the backdrop against which his behavior was justified. In middle school, Daniel got into a fight after a game and came home with scraped knuckles and a grin, and my parents praised his loyalty to the team while I cleaned the blood from his hands because my mother said I was good at that sort of thing. I remember the warmth of the sink water and the way my stomach twisted as he joked about the punch he landed, and my father clapped him on the back and told him to channel that fire into something useful. When I asked later why fighting was acceptable for him but not for me, My mother said girls needed to be careful and that Daniel had to learn how to defend himself, and the message settled into me like a rule I could never challenge. As we got older, the stakes grew, and so did the protection around him, and when Daniel broke curfew or wrecked his car, my parents argued quietly behind closed doors and emerged united in defense of him, telling neighbors and relatives that he was going through a phase and that families should support each other, not judge. When he shoved me once during an argument over the bathroom, my mother pulled me aside afterward and asked what I had said to upset him and told me to choose my words better next time because Daniel reacted strongly to criticism. I apologized even though my shoulder ached because apology was the quickest way to restore calm, and calm was the only peace available to me. Teachers and coaches echoed the same pattern and described Daniel as intense and competitive, while I was urged to be patient and understanding. And at home, my parents repeated that he carried the weight of expectations and that I should not add to it. By high school, his temper had become an open secret, and my parents treated it like a family quirk, something to be managed quietly and protected from outsiders, and I understood that the rules were clear, which were that Daniel mattered more than the truth and that my role was to absorb the fallout. Each time he crossed a line, the line moved, and each time I learned that accountability was optional if enough people wanted to believe a better story. This was the environment that shaped us, and it taught Daniel that he was untouchable, and it taught me that silence was safer than honesty. And by the time Thanksgiving arrived, years later, the foundation for that slap had already been poured and cured, and nobody at that table was truly surprised except me. The pattern hardened as adulthood approached, and Daniel carried his entitlement into every space he entered, and my parents carried the excuses with him like luggage they refused to set down. When he missed work or quit jobs, suddenly my mother said bosses were threatened by strong personalities, and my father said real men did not answer to anyone. And when I questioned how that would help him long term, they told me I was negative and unsupportive. I watched him learn that rage opened doors and that consequences bent away from him, and I watched myself learn that survival meant anticipation and silence and service. I learned to clean up after arguments and to apologize on behalf of peace, and to explain his behavior to relatives who asked uncomfortable questions. At family gatherings, my parents positioned me as the responsible one, and him as the sensitive one, and that framing followed us everywhere like a script nobody questioned. If Daniel arrived late, the schedule adjusted, and if I arrived late, it was a character flaw. If Daniel insulted someone, it was stress, and if I reacted, it was drama. Over time, this imbalance felt normal to everyone except me, and that isolation grew heavier because it told me that even my perception of reality could not be trusted. I learned to doubt my instincts and to catalog moments privately in my head because speaking them aloud only made things worse. By the time we were both adults, the household had trained itself to orbit Daniel and avoid collision at any cost, and I understood that the price of belonging was my compliance. This was the soil where violence could grow unnoticed, and the silence that protected him was the same silence that erased me. It set the stage for what happened that night and made clear that the slap was not an accident, but an outcome years in the making for everyone except me, who still believed things could be different despite all the signs. I left home as early as I could not because I was brave, but because staying felt like slowly disappearing, and independence was the only way I knew to protect what little sense of self I had left, and by the time I turned 18, I already understood that anything I wanted, I would have to earn without help or praise. While Daniel stayed home and drifted between plans my parents funded and abandoned, I worked evenings and weekends, saving every dollar so I could enroll in a medical assistant program at the community college across town. And the first day I put on scrubs, I felt something I had never felt before, which was useful. The work was not glamorous and the hours were long, but I liked the order of it, the charts, the routines, the way care followed steps and rules and logic, and nobody asked me to minimize myself to make someone else comfortable. I studied after midnight and took early buses and learned how to function on little sleep because I did not have the option to fail, and when I passed my certification exam, my parents nodded and said that was nice before turning the conversation back to Daniel and whatever crisis he was currently navigating. I paid my own tuition and bought my own books and took shifts nobody else wanted, and when I finally landed a job at a family clinic, I felt proud in a quiet, contained way because I knew better than to expect recognition. At the clinic, the expectations were clear and the boundaries mattered, and I learned quickly that patients trusted calm and consistency, and I was good at both. And for the first time in my life, authority did not feel like something that hovered over me waiting to correct me, but something I could rely on to keep people safe. My parents never visited my workplace and never asked about my days except to comment that the pay could not be very good and that I should think about something more ambitious like Daniel, who was always on the verge of finding his calling. Meanwhile, Daniel bounced between jobs and excuses, and my parents paid his phone bill and insurance and covered gaps without calling it what it was, which was support they never offered me. I stayed on the family phone plan because it was cheaper, and because my mother insisted it was practical, and I left a few boxes of childhood belongings in their basement because my apartment was small and because it felt easier than arguing. And those small ties became reasons I kept showing up for holidays even when every instinct told me not to. Thanksgiving was always framed as non-negotiable, and my parents said family obligations mattered more than feelings, and I told myself that one dinner a year was manageable and that I could endure a few hours of discomfort to maintain peace. I worked harder than most of my coworkers and took pride in doing things by the book, and when a nurse complimented my charting or a patient thanked me for listening, I carried that with me like proof that I existed beyond the narrow version of me my family allowed. At home, Daniel criticized my job and called it basic, and my parents laughed and said he was just teasing, and I smiled because smiling was easier than explaining why his words landed the way they did. I learned to compartmentalize and to leave work at work and family at arm length, and for a while that balance held because my life outside the house was growing, even as my place inside it stayed fixed. I paid my rent on time and built a routine and cooked for myself, and learned that independence was not loud or dramatic, but steady and earned, and when Thanksgiving came around again, I believed I could step into my old role for one night without losing the person I had become. I did not understand yet that progress threatened the system that depended on my silence, and that my stability made their excuses harder to maintain, and that walking into that house as someone who no longer needed their approval was the most dangerous thing I could have done. Thanksgiving always began with an unspoken contract that I would arrive polite, grateful, and quiet, and in return, the evening would pass without open conflict. And that year, I followed the script exactly because I arrived on time, brought a dessert my mother approved of, and complimented the house, even though nothing had changed since the last visit. The air felt tight from the moment I stepped inside, as if everyone was bracing for something they did not want to name, and my mother immediately commented on my posture, asking why I always looked tense, and my father joked that clinic work must be turning me rigid. Daniel was already there, sprawled on the couch watching the game, and when I greeted him, he barely looked up and said "hey" in a tone that made it clear I was an afterthought. Relatives trickled in, and the room filled with small talk and the clinking of glasses, and my mother floated between guests, praising Daniel for being so driven and creative, while mentioning my job only to say I worked long hours and worried too much. When an aunt asked how the clinic was going, my mother interrupted to say I was always stressed and needed to learn to relax, and Daniel laughed and added that I took everything too seriously, and everyone chuckled as if it were a harmless observation. I smiled and nodded because correcting them would have marked me as difficult, and I had learned that any attempt to define myself invited scrutiny and resistance. As dinner approached, my mother grew sharper, directing me to help in the kitchen, while Daniel remained seated, and when I asked if he could set the table, she waved me off and said he had been busy all week and deserved to rest. In the kitchen, she criticized the way I sliced vegetables and asked why I could not just follow instructions, and when I reminded her I did this every day at work, she said this was different and not to argue. At the table, the seating was arranged, so Daniel sat beside my father while I was placed near the end, and conversation flowed around me rather than with me, and each time I spoke, Daniel interrupted with a louder story, and my parents followed his lead. At one point, my father raised a glass and said he was thankful for Daniel, who always kept things lively and challenged the family, and then he added that he was thankful for me too, in a vague afterthought way that felt more like an obligation than appreciation. I felt my chest tighten, but I said thank you because anything else would have been labeled ungrateful. As the meal continued, Daniel made a joke about how sensitive I was, and my mother told him not to tease, but smiled as she said it and then turned to me and suggested I apologize for being tense and lighten the mood. I asked quietly what I had done, and my father sighed and said I always made things awkward and that Thanksgiving was about harmony and sacrifice, and that sometimes being part of a family meant swallowing your pride. The implication was clear, which was that I was expected to absorb discomfort so others could remain comfortable, and when I hesitated, my mother leaned in and said if I really cared about keeping the peace, I would just say sorry to Daniel. The request stunned me because I had done nothing but exist, and yet the pressure mounted as relatives glanced over, waiting to see what I would do. Daniel smirked and leaned back, enjoying the moment, and I realized that this was not about resolving conflict, but about reinforcing hierarchy. I said I would not apologize for something I had not done, and the table went quiet, and my mother stiffened, and my father looked at me as if I had betrayed him. Daniel scoffed and said I always played the victim, and my mother snapped that I was ruining the holiday and embarrassing them in front of everyone. The room seemed to tilt, and I felt years of swallowed words pressing against my throat, and when I tried to explain that I was tired of being blamed, my father cut me off and said now was not the time. My mother then said that she did not understand why I always made things so hard, and that maybe I should take a lesson from Daniel, who knew how to be grateful. That was when the tension sharpened into something dangerous, and I sensed it before it happened the way animals sense a storm. Because Daniel stood up suddenly and his chair scraped the floor, and nobody moved to stop him. In that moment, I understood that I had crossed an invisible line by refusing to apologize, and that the cost of that refusal was about to be collected. I did not go back inside the house after Thanksgiving and instead drove home with the heater blasting because my hands would not stop shaking and my cheek felt hot and swollen and the silence in my car was louder than the shouting had been, because it gave my thoughts room to spiral and replay every second of what had happened. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, breathing slowly the way I taught anxious patients to breathe, and I pressed an ice pack against my face while watching the swelling change color in the bathroom mirror and telling myself to stay calm and methodical because panic would not help me now. I took photos every hour with the timestamp visible because something in me had shifted from shock to instinct, and I understood that memory could be questioned, but documentation could not, and that realization brought a strange clarity. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were fractured images of the table, and my mother smoothing the cloth, and my father looking past me, and Daniel's hand moving faster than I could react. The next morning at the clinic, one of the nurses noticed the discoloration immediately and asked gently what had happened, and when I hesitated, she nodded as if she already knew and told me that if I was not ready to talk, I did not have to, but that I should document everything anyway. She showed me how to write a neutral incident summary, focusing on facts and times and actions, and suggested I get an urgent care note, even if I did not think I needed treatment, because medical records mattered, and I followed her advice because it felt safer to do something than to freeze. At urgent care, the provider examined my cheek and wrist and noted tenderness and bruising and asked if I felt safe at home, and I said yes, but not with my family, and she wrote that down without judgment and reminded me that delayed reports were common and valid. I went back to work with the paperwork folded in my bag, and my emotions finally caught up to me in waves that left me dizzy and hollow, and then unexpectedly steady because I could see a path forward that did not require my parents' approval. That afternoon, I filed a delayed police report, not because I wanted immediate action, but because I wanted a record, and the officer listened and asked clarifying questions and explained my options without pressure, and I left feeling shaken but grounded. The collapse came later when I sat alone on my couch and cried until my chest hurt, and then the clarity returned because I realized that nothing about what I had done invited violence, and nothing about protecting myself made me disloyal. I organized my photos, messages, and medical notes into a folder and labeled it plainly, and I felt a sense of control I had never been allowed before. The fear was still there, but it was quieter now because it had a container, and I understood that caring for myself meant believing my own experience even when my family refused to. The messages started the morning after I filed the report, and they came exactly the way I knew they would come at first, and framed as concern, because my family had always preferred subtle pressure over open confrontation when they wanted control. My mother texted asking if I was feeling better and saying that Thanksgiving had gotten out of hand and that everyone was emotional and tired, and I stared at the screen, noticing how carefully she avoided naming what had actually happened. When I did not respond, she sent another message saying she hoped I was not overreacting and that families sometimes said things they did not mean during stressful moments. An hour later, my father called and left a voicemail telling me that involving outsiders was unnecessary and that airing family issues only made things worse for everyone, and that I needed to think about the consequences of my choices. Daniel followed with a message that simply said, "Stop being dramatic," and accused me of trying to ruin his life over one mistake, and the familiarity of the words hit me harder than the slap had because I had heard versions of them my entire life. As the day went on, the tone shifted and the blame became clearer because my mother wrote that I had pushed Daniel too far and that I knew how sensitive he was and that if I had just apologized, none of this would have happened. She reminded me of all the times they had supported me and accused me of throwing it back in their faces, and my father added that family did not call the police on each other and that I was breaking an unspoken rule that kept families together. Each message landed like a calculated attempt to rewrite reality, and I felt the old confusion creeping in the urge to doubt myself and question my memory and wonder if I really had done something wrong. Instead of responding, I took screenshots and saved them with dates and times because the nurse at work had told me that patterns mattered, and reading the messages back to back made the pattern impossible to ignore. None of them asked if I was hurt, and none of them acknowledged Daniel's actions, and every single one framed my response as the real problem. My mother sent another message saying she was worried about my mental state and that she hoped I was not spiraling and that maybe I should take some time off work and talk to someone, and the implication was clear, which was that if I did not comply, they would reframe me as unstable. My father wrote that I had always been sensitive and that I tended to exaggerate situations and that I needed to stop letting my emotions dictate my actions. And when I read it, I realized that this was the same language they had used since I was a child whenever I tried to speak up. Daniel left a voicemail this time, his voice slurred, telling me that I was selfish and ungrateful, and that he could not believe I would do this to him after everything he had done for me. And I listened to it once and then saved it without replying. The more they wrote, the clearer it became that they were not interested in repair, but in restoring the old balance where I absorbed harm quietly so everyone else could stay comfortable. By the end of the day, my phone felt heavy with their words, and I turned it face down on the table and focused on breathing because the urge to defend myself was strong, but I knew from experience that defending myself only fed their narrative. I thought about how often they had told me that my feelings were the problem and how easily they shifted responsibility away from Daniel and onto me, and I felt anger rise for the first time without being immediately followed by guilt. I made a decision then to stop engaging and to preserve everything instead because silence was no longer submission but strategy. I created a separate folder for messages and labeled it clearly and backed it up because I understood now that gaslighting relied on isolation and forgetting, and I was done with both. That night, my mother sent one final text saying she hoped I would come to my senses and remember who my family was, and I looked at the screen and felt a strange calm settle in because I finally understood that they would never choose me over the version of reality that protected them. I blocked their numbers one by one, not in anger, but in self-preservation, and the quiet that followed was heavy and unfamiliar and frightening and also deeply relieving because for the first time the noise stopped and I could hear my own thoughts clearly enough to trust them. Going no contact was not a dramatic declaration or a single moment of courage, but a series of small, deliberate choices that added up to safety, and the first thing I did was block every number connected to my parents and Daniel, including secondary phones and old email addresses, because experience had taught me that one open door was enough for them to push through. I changed my voicemail greeting to remove my name and turned off read receipts and location sharing, and then I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone, feeling the weight of finality settle in, because even though the decision was necessary, it still felt like stepping into unfamiliar terrain without a map. The next step was practical and uncomfortable, which was telling my clinic manager that I was dealing with a family situation and might need support if anyone showed up unannounced, and she listened without interrupting and asked what I needed rather than questioning my judgment, and that simple respect steadied me. We reviewed the building protocol together, and she assured me that staff would not release information or allow visitors without approval, and she documented the conversation so there would be a record if needed. I adjusted my schedule slightly so I would not be leaving alone after dark, and I asked a coworker to walk with me to my car for a few days, and she agreed without hesitation and did not ask for details. At home, I checked the locks twice and replaced the weak one on the back door and moved my spare key out of its usual place and added a small motion light by the entry because it was affordable and gave me peace of mind. I wrote down a basic safety plan the way we advised patients to do, which included who to call if I felt threatened, where to go if I needed to leave quickly, and what documents I would take with me. And I felt strange doing it for myself, but also empowered, because planning turned fear into steps. I packed a small bag and placed it in my closet with essentials and copies of important papers, and I told myself that being prepared did not mean I expected the worst, but that I respected the reality of escalation. Emotionally, the shift was harder because the silence that followed no contact was loud, and my body kept expecting the next message or knock, and every unexpected sound made my heart jump. At the same time, there was a lightness in my chest that surprised me because without their constant commentary, my thoughts had room to stretch and settle, and I realized how much energy I had spent anticipating their reactions. I leaned into routines that grounded me, like cooking simple meals and taking walks and keeping my phone off my bed at night so I could sleep without checking it every few minutes. I told a close coworker and a friend from school what had happened in broad terms, and they believed me without needing evidence, and that belief mattered more than advice. There were moments of doubt when I wondered if I was being too harsh or too permanent, and those thoughts came mostly at night when old habits resurfaced. But I countered them by reading the messages I had saved and reminding myself that boundaries were not punishments, but protections. I learned to sit with the fear instead of arguing with it and to let it pass like weather, and slowly the fear lost some of its grip. Each day without contact reinforced the truth that distance did not destroy me but steadied me, and that safety was not something I had to earn by being agreeable. I changed my number at the end of the week and updated only a few trusted contacts. And when I hit save, I felt a quiet resolve settle in because this was not about revenge or winning, but about choosing a life where harm was not normalized. The relief came in waves, unexpected and sharp, and I allowed myself to feel it without guilt. Because for the first time, no contact felt less like loss and more like breathing room I had been denied my entire life. The escalation came quietly at first, and then all at once, the way storms do when the air has been wrong for days, and I knew something was off the moment the front desk called my extension and said there were people asking for me by name in the lobby. I felt my stomach drop because I had not told my family where I worked in years, and yet there they were, my parents and Daniel standing in a space that was supposed to be neutral and safe, and I told the receptionist not to let them back and thanked her for calling me instead of sending them through. My clinic manager met me in the hallway, and I explained calmly that they were not authorized visitors and that there was a history of harassment, and she nodded and followed protocol without hesitation. She approached them with another staff member present and asked them to leave the building, and when my father raised his voice and said he had a right to speak to his daughter, she repeated the request firmly and reminded him that this was a medical facility. Daniel stepped forward, then visibly agitated and demanded to see me, and when my manager said no, he started shouting that I was lying about him and trying to destroy the family, and patients began to look uncomfortable. The manager signaled security and called non-emergency police because they were refusing to leave, and the moment stretched uncomfortably long as my parents argued that this was a misunderstanding and that I was overreacting and that family matters should be handled privately. I stayed in an office with the door closed, listening to the muffled voices and focusing on my breathing because the old instinct to intervene and smooth things over tried to surface, and I had to consciously choose not to. When the officers arrived, they spoke with my manager and then with my family and explained that they needed to leave the property immediately and that returning without permission would be considered trespassing. Daniel scoffed and said this was ridiculous, and my mother cried and asked how I could do this to them, and my father accused the clinic of encouraging me to turn against my family. The officers remained neutral and repeated the instructions, and eventually my family left, still arguing among themselves, and the lobby slowly returned to normal. My manager documented the incident in detail, including names, times, and behaviors, and asked if I wanted a copy for my records, and I said yes, and felt a wave of gratitude for the professionalism that had just protected me without drama. Later that afternoon, an internal incident report was filed and circulated to administration, so front desk and security would know not to admit them, and I added my own statement describing prior contact attempts and the Thanksgiving incident without embellishment. Emotionally, the encounter left me shaken and tired, and I sat in my car afterward, staring at the steering wheel, while the adrenaline drained away because seeing them in my workplace felt like a violation that cut deeper than words. At the same time, something fundamental shifted because their behavior was no longer hidden within the walls of our family home, but visible to others and judged by neutral standards, and the difference mattered. The next day, my father called the clinic from an unknown number and left a message accusing staff of discriminating against him and threatening to report them, and the administration forwarded it to legal counsel and reminded him in writing that further contact would be treated as harassment. Daniel sent an email to the clinic address calling me unstable and unfit to work in healthcare, and that email was saved and flagged, and the irony was not lost on anyone. I was not punished or questioned or sidelined, and instead my supervisor checked in to ask how I was doing and whether I needed time off, and I declined because routine helped me feel steady. Over the next week, word spread quietly among staff that there was a family situation, and people treated me with a gentleness that did not feel like pity, and that distinction mattered. The escalation at work forced my parents and Daniel into a space where their usual tactics failed because authority did not bend to them and their outrage did not control the outcome. For me, it was terrifying and validating at the same time because it confirmed what I had suspected, which was that the problem was never my reactions, but their behavior. And once that behavior was placed under professional scrutiny, it collapsed under its own weight. The clinic incident became a turning point because it transformed fear into evidence and isolation into support. And it showed me that boundaries held not because I argued for them, but because they were enforced by systems that did not care about family hierarchy. After the incident at the clinic, I understood that relying on goodwill alone was no longer enough, and that authority mattered not as a weapon, but as a boundary that could not be argued away. And the next morning, I contacted a legal aid office recommended by our administration and scheduled a consultation during my lunch break. Sitting in a quiet room with neutral walls and a calm voice on the phone felt surreal because I was describing my own family as a potential legal problem, and yet the attorney listened without surprise and asked precise questions about dates, locations, and prior contact attempts. I explained the Thanksgiving incident, the delayed police report, the messages, and the workplace escalation, and she told me that what mattered was not whether I felt justified, but whether the pattern met criteria for harassment and potential abuse, which she said it did. She explained my options carefully, including a cease and desist letter documenting that contact was unwanted and outlining consequences if it continued, and the possibility of requesting a protective order that would be reviewed by a judge at a hearing. She was clear that nothing was guaranteed and that outcomes depended on evidence and behavior going forward, and that honesty helped more than dramatics, and I appreciated the straightforwardness. We drafted a letter together that afternoon using plain language and factual statements, and it was sent certified to my parents and to Daniel, instructing them to stop contacting me, my workplace, and anyone associated with me, and to stay away from my residence and clinic. Seeing the words in print felt grounding because they reflected my experience without emotion, and because someone outside my family acknowledged that boundaries were reasonable. The attorney advised me to keep a log of any further contact and to save all communications, and she walked me through how a hearing might proceed if I chose to request a protective order, explaining that it would be a civil process focused on safety rather than punishment. I left the office feeling steady and frightened in equal measure, because involving legal authority made the situation real in a way that could not be undone, but it also meant I was no longer alone in managing it. The letter worked temporarily, and for a few days there was silence. and I allowed myself to hope that the message had landed and that distance would finally be respected. That hope did not last long because my mother responded not with acknowledgement, but with a handwritten note left at my apartment door, claiming she did not understand why I was doing this, and insisting that the letter was extreme and unnecessary. I photographed the note and did not touch it, and emailed the image to the attorney who advised me to add it to my log and not engage. 2 days later, Daniel sent a message from a new account accusing me of trying to get him arrested and threatening to show up to clear the air. And that was the moment I decided to move forward with a request for a protective order because the boundary had been tested and ignored. Filing the request was procedural and unemotional and required me to lay out the facts clearly and concisely and attach documentation, and when I submitted it, I felt a release of pressure because the next steps would be guided by process rather than negotiation. A hearing date was set weeks out, and I was instructed on what to expect and what not to do, and the attorney reminded me that the goal was safety, not victory. In the meantime, the cease and desist letter provided a framework that law enforcement and institutions could reference, and that mattered because it removed ambiguity. At work, administration updated the trespass notice and confirmed that any attempt by my family to return would result in immediate police involvement, and they reassured me that my job was secure and my performance valued. The sense of authority surrounding me did not feel oppressive but protective, and I realized how unfamiliar that was and how much energy I had spent compensating for its absence. Emotionally, I oscillated between fear and relief because asserting boundaries through legal means felt like crossing a line my family had taught me never to cross, and yet each step affirmed that my safety mattered even if they disagreed. I prepared for the hearing by organizing my documents chronologically and practicing neutral language and reminding myself that telling the truth did not require embellishment. The existence of a date on a calendar where my experience would be acknowledged by an impartial authority gave me something solid to hold on to, and it shifted my focus from managing their reactions to protecting my future. The truth did not explode outward all at once the way lies often do, but instead spread slowly through ordinary conversations and shared observations, and it gained strength precisely because it did not rely on my voice alone. It began with relatives who had been present at Thanksgiving replaying the moment in their minds. Now that distance gave them clarity, and they remembered the sudden silence after my mother spoke, and the way Daniel stood up, and the way no one intervened. One aunt reached out to me through a neutral cousin to ask if I was safe, and when I confirmed that I was and did not offer details, the question itself traveled further than any explanation could have. At the same time, my parents attempted to control the narrative by telling select family members that I had overreacted and that I was unstable and being influenced by coworkers who did not understand family values. That strategy backfired because people compared notes and realized the stories did not align, and because my absence from gatherings made the tension impossible to ignore. Someone mentioned the clinic incident in a hushed conversation after church, and the fact that police had been involved shifted the tone immediately because authority changes how people listen. The receipts I had quietly saved became anchors when rumors reached me through indirect channels, and I shared them only when asked and only with people who mattered. And the images and voicemails spoke for themselves without commentary. The voicemail from my mother struck people especially hard because it framed the violence as my fault, and that framing unsettled even those who had previously defended my parents. Neighbors noticed the trespass warning posted discreetly near the clinic entrance and began asking questions, and the answers they received were procedural and factual and did not include my name, which made the curiosity sharper rather than duller. In spaces where my parents once held unquestioned credibility, there were now pauses and side glances and invitations that did not arrive, and my mother complained to relatives that people were being distant without understanding why. Daniel attempted to counter the shift by posting vague messages online about betrayal and fake victims and loyalty, and the lack of specifics only fueled speculation because those who knew us recognized the pattern of deflection. Meanwhile, people who had watched our family dynamics for years began to speak up in small ways and say that they had always wondered and that certain things had never sat right and that silence had been easier than confrontation. A church volunteer quietly stepped down from coordinating events with my parents, citing personal reasons, and my father stopped receiving calls for favors he once took for granted. And these were not punishments announced aloud, but consequences that accumulated through changed behavior. What surprised me most was how little I had to do to make any of this happen because the truth did not need my advocacy once the shield of privacy was gone. The more my parents insisted that nothing was wrong, the more their insistence clashed with observable facts, and the more people trusted what they could see over what they were told. I remained quiet and focused on my own life and resisted the urge to correct every rumor because restraint made my position credible and because engaging would have pulled me back into a dynamic I was leaving behind. When relatives asked directly, I answered honestly and briefly and directed them to the documentation if they wanted clarity, and most did not need it because patterns were already clear. The spread of truth felt both relieving and unsettling because it confirmed that I had not imagined the imbalance and that others had seen it too, but chosen comfort over action until now. As the weeks passed, the social isolation around my parents deepened in subtle ways, and invitations stopped and conversations shortened, and Daniel found fewer allies willing to echo his version of events. I learned that truth in community does not require loud declarations, but consistency, and that once authority and evidence intersect, narratives collapse under their own weight. Watching this unfold from a distance reinforced my decision to step back because the cost of proximity had always been my silence, and the benefit had always been theirs. The truth did not make me whole on its own, but it cleared the ground enough for healing to take root, and it marked the beginning of consequences that could not be negotiated away. Daniel did not change overnight, and that was the point, because consequences in real life rarely arrive as a single dramatic moment and instead accumulate until the weight becomes impossible to deny. The first shift came with the trespass notice because it followed him like a quiet shadow and changed how authority responded to him in places where he was used to being indulged. When he showed up angry at his workplace after a disagreement with a supervisor and raised his voice the way he always had, he expected the usual smoothing over, but the response was different this time because there was already a record and people were less willing to absorb his volatility. Human Resources documented the incident and reminded him of conduct expectations, and he scoffed and said they were overreacting and that everyone was too sensitive, which only reinforced their concern. A week later, he snapped at a coworker in front of a client, and the client complained, and management placed him on a performance plan that focused less on output and more on behavior and emotional regulation, and Daniel took it as an insult rather than a warning. He told anyone who would listen that his sister was trying to sabotage him and that none of this would be happening if I had not lied, and the repetition of that claim only highlighted how deeply he relied on blame to avoid responsibility. The police record from Thanksgiving did not result in charges, but it existed, and when Daniel was stopped for a minor traffic violation and became argumentative, the officer ran his name and took a slower, more careful approach, and the interaction ended with a citation rather than a warning. Daniel ranted about it afterward, saying the system was against him, and my parents echoed the sentiment, insisting he was being targeted unfairly and that he was under stress because of my betrayal. Stress did not explain the pattern anymore because the pattern had a paper trail, and people who had once laughed off his temper now took notes. At home, my parents grew quieter and more anxious as calls they expected did not come, and favors they assumed would be granted were declined, and Daniel felt that shift most acutely because he had always moved through spaces cushioned by their reputation. When he applied for a new position and was asked to provide references, he struggled to find supervisors willing to vouch for his temperament, and the absence spoke louder than criticism ever could. The culmination came when his employer called him into a meeting after yet another complaint and explained that while his technical skills were adequate, his behavior posed a risk and that the company could not continue to absorb that risk. He was terminated with documentation and an explanation that cited specific incidents and policies, and Daniel left furious and stunned because for the first time, anger did not open a door but closed one. My parents attempted to intervene by contacting the company and arguing that Daniel was being misunderstood, and the company responded through legal counsel, reminding them that further contact would be considered harassment, and the shock of being rebuffed deepened their panic. Daniel spiraled for a short period, posting vague accusations online and blaming conspiracies and loyalty tests. And those posts drew fewer reactions than he expected because the social tide had already turned. Friends who once excused his behavior now distanced themselves, and acquaintances stopped engaging, and the echo chamber grew smaller and harsher. What struck me was not satisfaction, but inevitability, because nothing about this outcome required my involvement beyond stepping out of the way and allowing systems to function as designed. Daniel faced consequences because he had always been shielded from them, and once that shield cracked, the same behavior produced predictable results. The golden child narrative could not survive documentation and neutral enforcement, and without my silence to smooth the edges, his actions stood alone. My parents framed his job loss as persecution and rallied briefly, but the energy waned as bills mounted and excuses ran out, and Daniel confronted the gap between how he saw himself and how the world responded. He did not apologize to me, and I did not expect him to, because accountability does not always come with remorse, but it does come with outcomes, and those outcomes reshaped his life in ways that could not be reversed by denial. Watching this from a distance, I felt a complicated mix of sadness and relief, because the cost of protecting him had always been mine, and with that cost removed, the truth stood unbuffered. The justice was quiet and procedural and unspectacular, and that was what made it real, because it did not rely on my pain for momentum, but on his behavior, meeting boundaries he could not bend. The letter arrived by certified mail on a quiet weekday afternoon, and the weight of the envelope alone told me it was meant to feel serious and official, as if presentation could substitute for accountability. I did not open it right away, and instead set it on the kitchen counter and finished making dinner because I had learned that urgency was one of the tools my family used to regain control. When I finally broke the seal and unfolded the pages, I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. Steady, deliberate, and carefully spaced, and the opening paragraph spoke about love and family and misunderstanding in language that sounded practiced and impersonal. He wrote that emotions had run high and that everyone had said things they regretted, and that time had a way of softening wounds if people allowed it to. And my mother added a paragraph in a different ink, describing how hurt she was that I had shut them out and how confusing it all felt for her. Nowhere in the first page did they mention the slap or the grabbing of my wrist or the voicemail that blamed me, and that omission felt louder than any accusation. The second page shifted into explanation and justification as they outlined their parenting philosophy and insisted they had always tried to meet each child's needs in different ways, and that Daniel required more support because he was sensitive and passionate while I was independent and strong. The words were familiar and rehearsed, and reading them, I felt a strange calm because I could see the pattern clearly without being inside it. They expressed sorrow that I felt hurt and disappointment, that things had escalated, and frustration that I had involved outside authorities when family issues should be resolved privately. That sentence sat heavy on the page because it reframed their exposure as my betrayal and their discomfort as the real harm. Toward the end, they proposed counseling with a mediator of their choosing and emphasized how important it was to present a united front to the community, and they closed by saying they hoped I could forgive them and move forward together. It was an apology shaped like a circle that never reached the center and never touched the behavior that had caused the damage. I read the letter twice and then handed it to a friend who had been with me through the weeks after Thanksgiving, and she summarized it in one sentence, saying they were sorry I reacted. Not sorry, they acted. That clarity settled something in me that had still been wavering, because I realized that responding would not lead to accountability, but to negotiation, and negotiation was how boundaries eroded. I documented the letter and added it to my records and sent a copy to my attorney and asked if I needed to respond, and she advised me that silence was a valid response and sometimes the strongest one. 2 days later, Daniel reached out through a professional networking site of all places, and his message was shorter and less polished than my parents' letter, but carried the same core deflection. He said he was sorry things got out of hand and that he never meant to hurt me, and that I should understand he was under a lot of stress and that family was all we had. He asked if I could help him explain things to people and smooth over misunderstandings because it was affecting his future. I stared at the screen and felt the old reflex to manage and mediate flicker and then fade because I could see that even now, his concern was reputation, not repair. I did not respond and instead blocked him there as well, and the quiet that followed felt decisive. A week later, my mother attempted contact again through a relative, claiming she wanted to apologize in person and that letters were inadequate and that she needed to see me to explain herself. The relative sounded nervous and conflicted, and I told her gently that apologies did not require access and that I was not available and that decision traveled back through the family network quickly. The attempts slowed after that, not because they understood, but because the avenues were closing and each closed door reinforced the reality that control had limits. I noticed how the guilt I had been trained to feel did not arrive the way I expected, and instead there was relief and a steady sense of alignment between my actions and my values. I was not punishing them or withholding forgiveness as leverage, and that distinction mattered because it meant my choices were not reactions but commitments to safety. The fake apologies exposed themselves by their focus on optics and reconciliation without change, and seeing them clearly allowed me to let go of the hope that had kept me tethered for years. I did not need them to understand for my boundary to be valid, and I did not need their remorse to justify my distance. The letter went into a folder and the messages stopped, and I moved forward, knowing that closure did not come from words written after the fact but from actions taken in real time. Healing did not arrive as a sudden sense of peace, but as a slow recalibration of my nervous system and my expectations, and the first step was admitting that I needed support that did not come with conditions. I started therapy with a clinician who specialized in family trauma, and during our early sessions I struggled to speak without minimizing because I had been trained to soften every experience to make it palatable for others. She noticed immediately and gently redirected me back to facts and sensations, asking where I felt things in my body and what my instincts were telling me now rather than what I had been told to believe. Over time, the sessions helped me separate responsibility from blame and understand that surviving in an unsafe environment had required skills that no longer served me and that learning new ones was not a betrayal of who I had been. I moved apartments shortly after and chose a place closer to work with better lighting and neighbors I recognized, and the act of packing and unpacking felt symbolic because each box carried less history than the last. At the clinic, my coworkers noticed the change in me and commented that I seemed steadier and more present, and I realized how much energy I had spent bracing for impact before. A few of us began sharing meals after long shifts, and those dinners were simple and unremarkable and free of tension, and the absence of fear felt like a luxury. On weekends, I met friends for walks and coffee and allowed myself to talk about ordinary things without scanning for reactions, and the ease of those interactions slowly rewired my sense of what connection could be. The holidays returned, and I braced instinctively and then remembered that I could choose differently, and instead of traveling, I hosted a small dinner with friends who brought mismatched dishes and laughed easily, and nobody commented on my tone or posture or appetite. We sat around a table that held warmth without obligation, and when the evening ended, I realized I had not felt the familiar exhaustion that usually followed family gatherings. In therapy, I learned to grieve the family I had hoped for rather than the one I had, and that grief came in waves unexpected and sharp and then softened into acceptance. I wrote letters I did not send and listed boundaries I would not cross again and practiced saying no without explanation, and each practice made the word feel less dangerous. My work continued to anchor me, and caring for patients reminded me daily that compassion did not require self-sacrifice and that professionalism could coexist with empathy. I updated my safety plan as life stabilized and eventually realized I no longer needed it the way I once had, and that realization marked progress rather than denial. The chosen family I built did not demand loyalty tests or silence, and they respected distance and celebrated growth, and that contrast highlighted how distorted my earlier experiences had been. I learned to trust my perceptions again and to sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it, and to recognize that conflict did not automatically lead to punishment. As the year turned, I felt a quiet pride in the life I was building because it was deliberate and grounded and free from the constant negotiation that had defined my past. Healing was not forgetting or forgiving on command, but integrating what had happened and choosing differently in its aftermath. And that choice, repeated daily, became the foundation of a future that felt open rather than constrained. I stopped checking for messages that would never come, and noticed how much mental space that freed, and I used that space to plan small joys and long-term goals without factoring in approval or backlash. The family I chose grew not from obligation, but from mutual care and shared respect, and that difference transformed ordinary moments into something meaningful. By the time winter settled in fully, I understood that healing was not an endpoint, but a practice, and that I was finally practicing it on my own terms, surrounded by people who saw me clearly and stayed anyway. Quiet justice did not arrive with applause or a courtroom scene, and it did not require me to speak at all because it unfolded through the steady application of boundaries and the simple refusal to participate in a system that had always demanded my silence. Over time, my parents lost the authority they once wielded, not because anyone punished them publicly, but because people stopped deferring to them, and the absence of that deference changed everything. Invitations slowed and then stopped, and conversations shortened, and assumptions of access dissolved, and the community adjusted without announcements or explanations. Daniel confronted a reality he had never faced, which was that charm and outrage did not erase records, and that patterns followed him wherever he went. And without my presence to absorb the impact his choices met resistance he could not overpower. I heard about these shifts indirectly through neutral channels and felt no urge to intervene because intervention had always cost me more than it protected anyone else. At work, I continued to build a reputation grounded in consistency and care, and when colleagues spoke about trust, they included my name without hesitation, and that inclusion felt earned and solid. The protective order hearing came and went with measured formality, and the outcome focused on distance and compliance rather than blame. And that focus suited me because safety was the point, not vindication. My parents complied after that, not because they agreed, but because consequences were clear and enforceable, and clarity had always been the missing piece. Months passed, and the intensity faded into something quieter and more durable, and I noticed how my body responded differently to stress now that it was not bracing for familiar harm. I slept through the night more often and laughed without scanning faces and made plans without calculating fallout, and those ordinary freedoms accumulated into a life that felt proportionate to my effort. When holidays returned, I chose simplicity and warmth and presence, and the absence of fear transformed the season into something new. I stopped rehearsing explanations for choices I no longer needed to justify, and that silence became a source of strength rather than isolation. Occasionally, I felt the old ache of wishing things had been different, and I let it pass without arguing because grief did not require resolution to be honored. The justice I experienced was not about watching others suffer, but about witnessing the end of impunity and the beginning of accountability where it belonged. My parents confronted a quieter world that no longer rearranged itself around their preferences, and Daniel encountered limits that did not bend, and those outcomes stood regardless of my feelings about them. I did not reconcile, and I did not seek forgiveness, and I did not need either to move forward because the measure of my life shifted from reaction to intention. The people I chose to keep close knew my story without needing proof and respected my boundaries without testing them, and that respect felt like the truest form of belonging. As time widened the distance between who I was and who I had been cast as, I understood that justice could be calm and persistent and deeply personal. It did not demand spectacle, and it did not require permission, and it did not ask me to minimize what happened for the sake of peace. It asked only that I live in alignment with the truth and protect the life I was building with care and consistency. When I think back to that night and the words that were spoken and the hand that struck me, I no longer feel defined by them because their power depended on my compliance, and that compliance is gone. The ending of this story is not a door slamming shut, but a room opening up, and I step into it with steadiness and relief and a clear understanding of my worth. They wished I was never born. I chose to live without them. If you stayed with me until the end of this story, I want to pause for a moment and speak directly to you, not as a character, but as a person who knows that stories like this are not rare and that many of us carry versions of them quietly. This channel exists for a reason, and that reason is not shock or drama, but recognition, because too many people have been taught to minimize harm in the name of family, and too many have been told that silence is the price of belonging. If parts of this story felt familiar, if you recognized the excuses, the gaslighting, the pressure to apologize for someone else's violence, I want you to know that your reaction is not weakness and your memory is not flawed. You are not imagining the pattern, and you are not alone in it. One of the most common messages I receive is from people who say they never realized their experience counted as abuse because there were no bruises that lasted or no police at the door. And I want to be clear that harm does not need to look extreme to be real, and protection does not require permission. If you are watching from the United States or anywhere else, and you are dealing with family members who excuse violence or demand your silence, I encourage you to document what happens and to talk to someone outside the system who can see it clearly, because clarity is the first step towards safety. If you are in a position where leaving feels impossible, start with small steps that increase your sense of control. Whether that means saving messages, taking photos, or quietly learning about resources in your area. If you are already out and building distance, I hope this story reminds you that boundaries are not cruelty and that choosing peace is not abandonment. For those of you who are watching as supporters, friends, or professionals, please remember that believing someone does not require full understanding and that your calm presence can make the difference between isolation and resilience. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to share in the comments what stood out most or where you are watching from, because community matters, and sometimes knowing you are not the only one is the beginning of healing. You do not need to share details you are not ready to share, but even a simple acknowledgement can help others feel seen. If you believe stories like this deserve space and care, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, because it helps these conversations reach people who may need them quietly late at night. We publish regularly, and each story is told with the intention of honoring lived experience while keeping safety and realism at the center. If you have a story you want told or a theme you want explored, you can leave a suggestion, because this channel grows through shared voices and shared courage. And if you are someone who has been told to forget to move on or to forgive before you are ready, I want to leave you with this reminder that healing is not a performance and justice does not have to be loud to be real. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step out of harm and build a life that no longer requires your silence. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for choosing stories that prioritize truth, dignity, and quiet strength.